During the summer of 2023, America was hit by a cultural storm in the form of Barbenheimer. Vastly different films, Barbie and Oppenheimer were both set to release on July 21st. What started as memes that pitted the two films against one another to contrast their wildly different themes morphed into a social phenomenon where moviegoers watched both films back to back. The movies were smash hits, with Barbie finishing number 1 and Oppenheimer finishing number 3 in the global box office for 2023. Oppenheimer's success was an anomaly. In an industry where fiction consistently dominates, this non-fiction film about the man who helped develop the atomic bomb was able to become not just a feature film in the US, but around the world. Part of what made the movie so popular was its ability to tell the pieces of Robert J. Oppenheimer's story that were a mystery to most people. Even those who were knowledgeable about the inner workings of the Manhattan Project were unlikely to know about Oppenheimer's school days or the trials he faced before the US Congress. After the bombs were dropped, Oppenheimer continued to follow its namesake story. I'm your host, Joseph Deagan, and today's show will follow a different path, that of the aftermath of the country that was left to deal with the fallout, Japan, and the US's role in rebuilding that which it had destroyed. On August 6th, 1945, the atomic bomb Little Boy was dropped on Hiroshima. 3 days later, a second atomic bomb, Fat Man, was dropped on Nagasaki. These bombings, combined with the Soviet invasion of Manchuria on August 8th, led Emperor Hirohito to announce Japan's surrender on August 15th. By September 2nd, Japan had formally surrendered to General MacArthur on board the USS Mississippi, marking the official end of the Second World War. MacArthur had his work cut out for him as the leader of the occupation. Though the main islands had never been invaded, years of siege through mining Japan's harbors, sinking Japan's merchant fleet, and bombing Japan's cities had left the island nation in shambles. The Japanese economy was on the brink of collapse, and its people were starving. Though previous plans to rebuild Japan had been centered around a multinational effort, similar to that of Germany's reconstruction, the US decided to spearhead the Japanese reconstruction, providing very limited avenues for intervention by the other allies. The occupation intended to demilitarize Japan, democratize its government, and initiate reconstruction of the Japanese economy. The first step of the occupation was to determine who would lead the massive effort. President Truman decided on General Douglas MacArthur. MacArthur was very knowledgeable about the East Asian region. Growing up, his father had been the military governor of the Philippines, a US territory at the time. MacArthur's military career would see him return to the Philippines as a military advisor. His position placed him at the forefront of the war in the Pacific. When Japan launched a sneak attack on Pearl Harbor, it simultaneously began its invasion of the Philippine Islands. Though MacArthur failed to initially defend the Philippines, he vowed to return, and ultimately succeeded when the US recaptured them in 1944. MacArthur was not only familiar with the country he would be occupying, but also the art of occupation itself. After the First World War, MacArthur was in charge of the Rainbow Division's military occupation along the Rhine. His experience led him to understand that military occupations fail because the occupying force fails to establish a path for a return to independence, either because the government or the people become too reliant on the occupiers. In his memoirs, he wrote, "If any occupation lasts too long, or is not carefully watched from the start, one party becomes slaves and the others masters." As such, one of his first priorities, before administering changes in Japan, was to address the starvation of the Japanese people. To this end, the hundreds of thousands of incoming American troops were to be fed by imported food, rather than the limited local food supply. This was very different from past military occupations, where a home nation is typically expected to provide food for the occupying army. By prioritizing the welfare of the Japanese, rather than exploiting them, MacArthur made a crucial first step in developing the trust required for a working relationship between the US and Japan. The general continued to rapidly institute policies, many of which were distinctively different from Germany's occupation, and with his role as the supreme commander of the Allied powers in Japan, or SCAP, the US government provided MacArthur with the autonomy required to do so. For instance, the US led the occupation of Japan due to MacArthur's insistence. MacArthur went so far as to threaten a Soviet general that he would have him arrested if he tried to intervene. MacArthur also pushed Congress to remove the Japanese emperor, Hirohito, from the top of the list of wanted war criminals. MacArthur believed that any attempts to completely dismantle the monarchy would put the entire occupation at risk. Instead, Hirohito and MacArthur met on September 27th, where they successfully found common ground and began working together towards the betterment of Japan. After only a little over a month, the general placed Japan on a different path than Germany, but a promising one nevertheless. MacArthur continued to work as the Allied leader of the occupation for 6 of the 7-year-long occupation. These 7 years of occupation can be split into 3 distinct phases. The first phase was removing Japan's ability to threaten other countries. Though measures were taken to dismantle Japan's military, it was also believed that for Japan to become a truly peaceful nation, it needed to be democratic. With this in mind, from 1945 to 1948, the primary goals of the occupation were to demilitarize Japan and install a democratic government. During this time, the occupation oversaw the Japanese military destroying their own weapons and military manufacturing capabilities. Millions of Japanese soldiers needed to transition from the military back into civilian life. This issue was compounded by the millions abroad who needed to return home. Many of these soldiers returned aboard Japanese transport vessels. Much of the success of the demilitarization process was a result of the willingness of the Japanese military to work with the US in dismantling its military capabilities. The first phase saw other important changes that helped Japan transition into a democracy. Japan's economy became more egalitarian through the process of land reforms and the breaking up of Japanese monopolies called zaibatsu. Zaibatsu were family-owned vertical monopolies that began to gain power during the Meiji Restoration, and by World War II held significant sway within the Japanese government. Also of note were the Tokyo trials. Similar to the German Nuremberg trials, these trials administered justice for Japanese war criminals. As such, the Tokyo trials followed the model of the Nuremberg trials, but they were far less publicized in the US. Furthermore, topics that criticized Hirohito were censored under the direction of General MacArthur to protect cooperation between the US and Japan. In 1947, the Japanese Congress passed a constitution that reduced the emperor to a figurehead and banned Japan from engaging in any acts of war, except self-defense. However, the constitution was primarily written by 2 US military officers, resulting in criticism about how democratic the process truly was. By 1948, the initial goals of demilitarization and democratization were accomplished, but due to fears of communism spreading into Japan, reconstruction in the form of stabilizing Japan's economy became a central goal as well. This resulted in the second stage of the occupation, where the US walked back some of its former policies. For example, the breakup of the zaibatsu was halted due to the stability that they provided the Japanese economy. In the same vein, a planned general strike by Japanese unions was banned by the SCAP despite its admittance under previous US policy. MacArthur claimed allowing the strike would fracture Japan's economy, but was criticized for being undemocratic in his interference. In 1950, the National Police Reserve was established to decrease the US strain of providing for Japan's defense during the Cold War. This later morphed into Japan's current military, the Japanese Self-Defense Force. By the end of the second stage, all 3 of the goals of demilitarization, democratization, and reconstruction were achieved. The third stage was the wind down of the occupation. US forces gradually left Japan, except for Okinawa, which remained under the control of the US until 1972. Japan and the US signed a bilateral defensive alliance, and Japan signed the Treaty of San Francisco, where it announced itself as an imperial power, promised reparations for aggrieved countries, and formally ended the US occupation of Japan. Over its 7 years, more than 1 million Allied service members were stationed in Japan. The subsequent cultural mingling deeply affected each country and contributed to the strengthened relations present today. While currently, Japan is one of the US's closest partners, it is important to remember the history that brought the 2 nations together. The occupation has left a lasting legacy on Japan. The country's adoption of Article 9 in its constitution prevented it from ever again declaring an offensive war. Japan has continued as a stable democracy, with the emperor remaining as a symbolic head of state. Japan's current position as the 4th largest economy in the world is in part due to the decisions made during the era of Reconstruction. Controversies remain surrounding Japan's refusal to acknowledge some of the atrocities it committed during the war. With the popularity of Oppenheimer and the wake of the failure of the US occupation of Afghanistan, many Americans are looking back to understand the US's most successful occupation. If there's one lesson to take away from the occupation, let it be this: your enemies today may be your greatest friends tomorrow, if you are willing to offer the olive branch